The very name evokes the golden dust of country roads, the sparkle of stage lights, and a voice that once made millions of hearts tremble with simple honesty. Yet behind that familiar hat, the perfectly poised smile, and the records that broke every conceivable chart, there is a story few have dared to whisper. A story of pain, of regret, of the kind of isolation that fame can carve into a man's very soul. Tonight, we peel back the curtain, past the sold-out arenas, past the country awards and the endless tours, to uncover the truths George Strait's closest friends and family have struggled to speak for decades. It begins in San Antonio, Texas, where the young George grew up dreaming not of fame, but of music that could fill the empty spaces life left behind. He was shy, almost painfully so, a boy with a voice that seemed too large for his small frame. Teachers adored him. Neighbors whispered about the golden boy who sang like the future itself had been gifted to him. But even then, behind the gentle manners, there was a shadow. His father, a stern man with old Texan pride, demanded perfection. Any slip of emotion, any weakness, and George learned early that it would not be tolerated. That discipline shaped him, yes, but it also carved the first invisible cracks in the man who would one day be called the king of country. By the late 1970s, George's career began to take flight. Record labels courted him. Television appearances were scheduled. And yet, the very success that should have brought joy carried a secret weight. Those who toured with him recall moments when, after the applause faded, George would retreat alone, staring at nothing, a cigarette burning in the ashtray, whispering to no one, "I can't stop feeling like I'm losing myself." Few understood what he meant, and fewer dared ask. But some of those closest to him would later confide that he suffered from bouts of crushing anxiety, so severe that he sometimes could barely step onto the stage, even when tens of thousands awaited him. Marriage brought its own complexities. With his beloved wife, Norma, George found stability, a family to anchor him. Yet fame, as it often does, cast long, unrelenting shadows. Rumors swirled, never scandalous but persistent enough to gnaw at his peace. Other country stars, men and women he respected deeply, people like Reba McEntire and Alan Jackson, watched with concern as George withdrew, his smiles increasingly practiced, his laughter measured. Friends would later admit, off camera, that he had confided in them about sleepless nights, about the pressure to maintain a public perfection while battling private demons no one could see. There were whispers of health concerns, whispered quietly among the inner circle, but never publicly acknowledged. Some nights, after sold-out shows, George would be found in his tour bus, head in his hands, a bottle of prescription painkillers at his side. "It's not the music," he once told a close friend, voice barely audible. "It's surviving the music. It's surviving the life it demands." Friends feared secretly that the relentless grind could break him. They feared even more that George Strait, the icon, the legend, might be living a life more tragic than any country ballad could capture. And then there was the family pain, the kind that no spotlight could ever illuminate. Rumors of silent arguments, of unspoken grief over family members struggling with illness, began to surface. His brother, close in age but estranged for years, reportedly tried reaching out in the late 90s, but the barriers George had built were almost unbreachable. He loved his family more than anyone, a source would later reveal, but sometimes love wasn't enough. The world demanded a George Strait that could never rest. It was a paradox that haunted him, to be adored by millions while feeling increasingly disconnected from the people who mattered most. Who mattered most. Even the simplest moments of joy seemed tinged with regret. Backstage photos show smiles, but the eyes, those blue Texan eyes, sometimes betrayed a sadness so deep it left those who glimpsed it trembling. Fellow performers recall nights at award shows when George would quietly slip out of sight, seeking refuge in the dim corners, muttering to himself about missed opportunities, about songs he'd written and never recorded, about moments in life he could never reclaim. And yet every morning, he would rise, hat in hand, ready to perform again, to meet the adoration of crowds who had no inkling of the private torment concealed beneath the cowboy persona. This story, as we will continue to uncover, is not simply one of fame or music. It is a story of hidden truths, of illnesses endured in silence, of last words never spoken to those who needed to hear them most, and of a man wrestling with mortality in ways his fans could never imagine. George Strait may have sung of simple life, of love and heartbreak, but the real story behind the man, what he sacrificed, what he feared, what he quietly mourned, is a melody far more haunting, far more human, and far more devastating than any song ever recorded. Beloved George Strait's silence often spoke louder than any song ever could. In the early 2000s, as the years of touring piled up like invisible weight, those closest to him began noticing subtle changes. His once effortless charisma on stage was still there, but backstage, the man who had once carried himself with unshakable calm now moved with a careful, almost haunted precision. Insiders recall whispered phone calls late at night, conversations where he would cry softly into the receiver, telling only fragments of the truth. "I can't do this without them," he said once, voice cracking. I can't keep pretending." The them he referred to were not fans, not critics, not even the endless entourage. He meant his family, the few people who saw past the legend, the hat, the effortless voice. Illness began to shadow him quietly. For years, the reports were buried, downplayed by his team, dismissed as fatigue or the natural strain of decades on the road. But a friend of the family, speaking under the strictest promise of anonymity, later revealed that George had been quietly battling an early form of degenerative heart issues, a condition exacerbated by stress and years of relentless touring. He would never talk about it publicly, the friend said. He didn't want anyone to worry. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted to keep singing. Yet even as he performed to packed arenas, those closest to him noticed a pallor in his skin, a hesitation in his step, a tremor in moments of private solitude. There was tragedy intertwined with the peaks of his career. In 2004, a distant cousin, someone George had been particularly close to in his youth, passed away unexpectedly. He was devastated, but could not allow the grief to show, not on stage, not in interviews. He privately told a friend, "I feel like every joy I've had is shadowed by the people I lose. It's like the applause is louder because I'm trying to drown it out." This pattern, grief masked by professionalism, would repeat itself over and over, leaving a trail of unseen sorrow. People who toured with him recall nights when, after the lights went down and the fans departed, George would sit alone in the bus, staring at the dark Texas highways, whispering songs he had never recorded, songs about loss and regret, as though speaking them aloud could exorcise the pain. Even his relationships with other Hollywood figures carried layers of hidden tension. Legendary country artists like Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton had noticed George's growing distance from the community. "He's always been humble," Dolly once said privately, "but there's a sadness he carries alone. He never lets anyone in, and that's why it hurts him most." George's isolation was compounded by the constant demand to maintain a flawless image. Every public smile, every perfectly timed anecdote, every gracious nod to reporters was a carefully constructed shield against the storm raging inside. Those closest to him feared that one day the storm would overwhelm him and they were powerless to stop it. Behind closed doors, family pain ran deep. George's marriage, while outwardly stable, was marked by quiet arguments, moments of tension, and nights of separation under the same roof. His wife, Norma, stood by him through decades of touring, public appearances, and personal struggles, but even she later confided that the emotional toll was immense. "He loved us," she whispered, tears welling. "But sometimes I felt like I was losing him to the life he built, to the legend, to the hat everyone sees but no one knows." The children, too, were painfully aware of the sacrifices. Family gatherings were often muted, brief, the weight of unspoken words hanging like heavy curtains over the room. There were moments, rare and fragile, when George broke entirely. Fellow performers recall an awards show where, after accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award, he retreated backstage and collapsed into the arms of a friend, sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't do it anymore," he said through gasps. "I just can't keep carrying this." It was a shocking sight, an icon reduced to raw, unguarded vulnerability. In that moment, the applause, the cameras, the fame, all of it meant nothing. It was a reminder that beneath the cowboy hat, beneath the accolades, there was a man who had endured decades of invisible struggle, a man for whom every performance was both triumph and trial. And yet, through it all, George Strait persisted. He continued to write, to sing, to perform, even as the cracks in his life deepened. He found solace in music, in the small, hidden moments when he could allow himself to feel without expectation. But those who knew him best feared that the real George, the man behind the legend, was becoming increasingly unreachable, lost somewhere between the weight of his private sorrows and the unyielding demands of the public eye. Legendary George Strait's greatest secret, the one that haunted him most, was not a scandal nor a public failure. It was the quiet erosion of his own health and the knowledge that time was slipping faster than any stage spotlight could illuminate. By the late 2010s, whispers began circulating among insiders about hospital visits, sudden cancellations of tours, and moments when George appeared frail during performances. His team remained tight-lipped, insisting it was routine checkups, but those closest to him knew the truth. Decades of touring, late nights, stress, and a relentless public gaze had taken a toll far beyond what the public ever imagined. The tragedy was compounded by moments of profound regret. George often confided to confidants that he wished he had slowed down, that he had missed milestones in his children's lives, that he had prioritized the career over the quiet, tender moments that truly define a life. "I traded lullabies for microphones," he admitted in a rare moment of vulnerability to a close friend, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know if I can ever get them back." These weren't words for interviews or public appearances. They were the private lament of a man who had devoted himself entirely to his craft at the cost of everything he held dear. Even the music itself became a mirror of his inner turmoil. Songs about love, loss, and the simplicity of life, the very songs that fans celebrated, often carried a hidden, haunting weight for George himself. He would write lyrics in the dead of night, pouring into them emotions he could never voice aloud in public. Fellow songwriters recall reading drafts of songs that were never released, songs so raw, so heartbreakingly intimate that they left the reader shaking, a man confronting mortality, isolation, and sorrow that the world could never fully see. "Those songs were George," one son. Grider said, "The legend is one thing. The man, the real man, is in those pages." Family pain continued to shadow him. His children, now older, bore the quiet scars of a father who was present physically, but often lost in his own struggles. Even Norma, ever the steadfast partner, admitted that she sometimes felt like she was holding a life together for someone else entirely. Friends recount moments where George would sit silently in the living room, staring at photographs, murmuring apologies to family members for moments he could not reclaim, for words never spoken, for love he felt compelled to bury beneath the demands of fame. He carried guilt like a second skin, one family friend revealed. He never let it show, but it never left him. And yet, there were glimpses of hope, of tenderness, fleeting and fragile. George would occasionally invite close friends and family to private jam sessions, moments when the hat came off, the microphone was absent, and the man himself emerged. In those spaces, tears were shed freely, laughter occasionally broke through, and for a few precious hours, the weight of decades of unspoken suffering seemed to lift. But even then, the shadow lingered, a reminder that the public persona and the private man were worlds apart, connected only by a voice that millions adored but few truly understood, of the public eye. It was during these years that whispers of his last words began to circulate among his inner circle. Not in the sense of finality, not of death, but words spoken in moments of absolute vulnerability. "I just want to be free of this," George said to one longtime friend, voice trembling. "Free of expectation, free of all the lights, free to just be George, not the legend." Those words, shared in hushed tones, carried a weight that few outside his inner circle would ever grasp. They were a confession, a warning, and a plea all at once, an acknowledgement that beneath the gold records and sold-out arenas was a man yearning for peace,